Hello and welcome to this presentation on supporting children and young people through bereavement and loss. My name's Megan Smith. I'm a senior educational psychologist and I work in the therapeutic part of the psychology and therapeutic services within Suffolk County Council. This presentation is a subset of training that we do to the Emotional Literacy Support Assistants, otherwise known as ELSAs, in Suffolk. This forms part of the morning on day 5 of 6 days of training. The ELSAs have a longer presentation that includes more slides and also covers family separation, which I'm not going to do here. I also run this session slightly longer and more interactive, about once a term, at least 2 times a year anyway, and that's available on Suffolk CPD online. So if you're interested in that, do look out for that too. You will see some of these slides again though, but I have an opportunity hopefully to talk about them. Just a warning as well. Obviously this is quite a difficult topic, so the benefit of a recorded session is that you can come in and out as you need, but the downside is I'm not there to kind of offer any support. So do be kind to yourself, take breaks and kind of come to this when you're kind of ready to do it. You'll also see the Wellbeing in Education logo there, so this is forming part of those resources, and there'll be a link to our wider kind of resources at the end of this session. So the aims of this session are to raise awareness of the extent of loss and bereavement in children's lives, and I guess why we all need to be aware of the need to support children. I want to consider the grieving process, and there's a few models that I want to share with you. Understand the developmental nature of children's responses to death, so how that might change as they get older, and generally try and increase your confidence to support children and young people when they have been bereaved or experienced loss, and start to introduce some ways that you might be able to support. But obviously that's something we talk about in more detail in the ELSA training or in the longer session, so that might be something you want to consider, but I will signpost you to some resources. This slide describes some of the common areas of loss that many, or indeed all children and young people will have experienced or will experience during their lifetime. So the first picture at the top of the screen there with the back to school and the crayons is referencing the loss of familiar environment for children, and generally that comes through transitions. So children will have transitioned from family to early years settings to various schools, and all of the changes of environment and factors within them that will have brought. Some children will have changed schools more frequently. Maybe they're a forces family, maybe they've moved home or moved school for another reason. So there will be, an increased number of transitions within there. And with those transitions, in that next picture, you've got the child with the adult. There will be some loss of some trusted adults, be they nursery teachers, teachers within school, and other significant adults. There will be significant adults that they've lost contact with because of moves of house, so maybe neighbours and family friends, maybe due to family separation, there's less contact with members of their family, or no contact now, and maybe there are other losses of adults that have come through other means. You've got the third picture there with the loss of parental attention in this situation because there's been a new baby in the family, and that will have been an experience for many children, but maybe that loss of attention comes through other means. Maybe there's been an illness within the family, maybe there are mental health difficulties, maybe there are financial pressures on the family, unemployment, that has impacted on the attention that's available for the child. Maybe grandparents are ill, so the parent has multiple things that they're trying to juggle, and maybe there's a period where the child is getting less attention than they did beforehand, and that being a loss for them. The first picture at the bottom shows a rift between two children, so maybe there are losses of friendships and peers for those children. Maybe that has come about through conflict, maybe that's come about again through one of those transitions, so they've moved away from a close friend and all that means. The be careful sign is talking about the loss of opportunity that some children will have experienced, and maybe that's due to the environment that they live in and they can't play out safely, and so there's a loss of opportunity there. Maybe it's to do with school or curriculum pressures that is impacting on their ability to play or do other social things, and maybe there are financial pressures you have in that last picture that is impacting on their leisure activities, their holidays. Maybe there was a holiday planned that now can't happen for a variety of reasons. So seeing opportunities sometimes as a loss that children are having to come to terms with as well. Children may also have experienced more unusual loss, and that's kind of thinking about children who've experienced death or bereavement. So it's more likely they will have experienced death, say, of a pet or a grandparent, but a number of children within our schools and settings will have experienced the death of a parent or a sibling. And again, the numbers are higher than you might expect. So I think Winston's Wish website talks about approximately 1 in 25 young people and children having experienced the death of a parent or a sibling. So there are health kind of unusual losses as well, maybe a catastrophic accident or illness within the family, or a lifelong disability, or which may is a limited number of children and young people, but will be impacting on some of the children and young people that you're working with. And also thinking about unusual losses related to trust of adults. So those children that you're safeguarding within schools and settings who may have experienced various kinds of abuse, and the kind of loss of trust that comes with that. So that kind of gives the sort of broad areas of loss, and then this more specific kind of unusual losses that children may have experienced. And there are some key principles thinking about how to support children and young people who've experienced these kinds of losses. The first principle is that grief is normal. So often what we're doing when we're supporting young people and children is normalizing the emotions and the experiences that they're having. The second principle is that our view is that grief counselling is not routinely needed for children who've experienced a grief or a loss. Most children are going to want to be supported by the adults that they know well, so those in their family, those in their school or setting. And it's only really where children and young people get particularly stuck in the process of grieving or asking for more support that we might want to consider more specialist bereavement support. And I'll signpost some of those later in this session as well. The third principle is that recovery from loss is an active process, and it's going to be unique to each individual. So there will be some common features, and I'm going to share some models with you that may be useful for your understanding, but also possibly sharing with older young people. But actually we need to be guided by the child or young person as to how it is that they want us to support them, and being led by their preferences. The fourth principle is that the death of someone close is almost certainly going to give rise to very powerful emotions. You may not see those emotions in the school or setting, and some children feel more comfortable sharing those at home, but those feelings will exist, and they're going to be very unfamiliar to children and young people. As a result, as a professional working with those children and young people, we can feel very uncomfortable and helpless in those situations, whether that's a colleague that we're supporting or whether that's a child or young person. We may not know how to give appropriate support. And so the hope for this session is it gives you some confidence about your ability to support in this area, and offers you some kind of signposting as to some support that you might like to look into further. So this is the first model that I'm going to share with you, and this is perhaps a more traditional or old-fashioned model of bereavement. I'm sharing it with you though because there are some useful elements of it, particularly the feelings that are shown here. I think those are feelings that people who have been bereaved report that they have experienced. I think what is perhaps now more outdated is the staged model aspect of it, so that we don't now think that people move stage by stage through this process and complete one stage before they move on to the next stage. I think we're aware that it's a lot more messy and messed up than this model suggests. There's also a kind of a time implication that goes with this model, so a sense of the first year being the most difficult and getting better, you know, beyond that. And again, acknowledging that we don't really know that, it's kind of unique to the individual, so being aware of that too. But the feelings that are described there, as I said, I do think are accurate. So it starts there with a sense of shock and disbelief and denial, and certainly a number of people do report experiencing these feelings. It describes a sort of protest about the loss that has happened and the pain of the separation with the person that's died. There may be despair there, and there are feelings there that particularly seem to go with loss and bereavement, and that sort of guilt and anger, and then sadness and depression. And it also talks about adjustment and acceptance of the loss and bereavement, and knowing that that is a part of the bereavement process. But again, it may be happening all the way through the process. So the second model that I'm sharing with you from Shelley Gilbert's work is called the upward spiral of grief. And I think people find this a more helpful model of what might be happening. So you have many of the similar emotions that you had on that previous slide, but they're represented throughout the model. So the concept is that you start in the darker place at the center and you gradually move to the outside of the spiral where it starts to feel a little bit lighter. But you'll notice still at the outside of that model, you've still got all of those feelings, the anger, guilt, the sadness. One of the differences about this model is you have got happy in there as well, and certainly children and adults will say that they feel guilty when they feel happy, and again, a kind of normalizing that it's okay to have periods of happiness too. You've also got adjustment in there and confusion, in addition to some of those other feelings, and relief, which may be there depending on the circumstances of the loss and bereavement as well. So kind of normalizing a broader range of feelings there, and the fact that they're a bit messier and messed up. This is a lovely model called the dual process model of coping, and it describes how children and adults kind of move between two ways of being during a bereavement. So there's a loss-oriented space where the child may be working actively on their grief, or the grief may be intruding into their daily life. So it may involve some kind of denial and avoidance of wanting to move on and kind of stay within this kind of very sad place. And then there's a restoration-oriented space where maybe the person is distracting themselves from those strong feelings of grief and a kind of a denial or avoidance of grief. But it's also the part where they're actively exploring exploring those new roles and what their identity is and their new relationships given this loss and bereavement. And most people will move or oscillate between those two areas. Certainly for adults, there will be a lot of doing that's required at the start of a loss of bereavement, kind of organising funerals, letting people know, sorting out finances, and that keeps them in that restoration oriented space. And maybe people will continue to try to do because they don't want to move into that loss oriented space. But the thinking is that we do need to do some work there too, but kind of understanding why somebody may want to avoid that at the beginning. Somebody has described this for children and young people as puddle jumping, which I think is a really lovely expression. And so I think it's, if you're working with a child or young person, it's kind of knowing which puddle they're in at the time that you meet them, and you won't know that until they're there in front of you. And maybe they want to be doing some restoration oriented work, or maybe they want to be loss oriented, and kind of being guided by them as to what they need from you at the point at which you're seeing them, and that being okay. This is the final model that I'm going to show you, which is a kind of a more modern model, and certainly one that the ELSAs that we work with really like, and will sometimes share with certainly older young people and find that quite helpful. So this comes from Lois Tonkin's model called Growing Around Grief. So this model, so the grief in this picture is shown by the grey dot in the middle, and at the start of the process on the left hand side, that grief is all consuming. So it fills kind of every part of their being, their thinking and their feeling. And then gradually over time, but kind of no time expectations on how long that might be, the size of the grief is staying the same, but their life is growing around that grief and giving them a bit more space. And what we're hoping as we're kind of working with the child or young person, or they're working through things on themselves, is they get to the point where their life has kind of grown big enough around that they can be functioning and gaining what they want from life, but with that kind of grief still a part of them. And certainly people who've been bereaved have said they prefer this model because for the grief getting smaller gives them a sense that actually maybe they're forgetting this very significant person that was in their life and is no longer there. So the grief is an important kind of connection to them, and wanting that to stay. So Barbara Munro adapted this model, and this is what ELSAs sometimes use with children. So she uses balls and jars. And in the kind of more traditional model of bereavement, you would have the ball in the first jar, and the ball really fills up the jar. It's quite tight to fit in. Once it's in there, it doesn't really move around. It takes up all of the space. And then the thinking is that over time that ball gets smaller, and so it can rattle around more in the side, and there's more space for other thinking and other doing. So that's the kind of traditional model, but again, as I said before, it comes with some uncomfortableness for some people that are bereaved, that they don't want the grief or that ball to get smaller, because it means that they're forgetting the person and losing their connection with them. So an easier way for them to think about it and understand it is where the ball stays the same, so their grief remains and their connection with the person that died, but the jar gets bigger. So again, at the start, the ball is quite tight, it fills up all the space, it doesn't move around, it's all consuming, but gradually over time we grow our jar or our life, and there's more space for that ball to move around. So I say ELSAs have created this with jars and balls, and found it quite helpful to use with some children and young people. So just thinking about some of the behaviour changes that you might see in children where there has been a loss or a bereavement, so things to look out for. There may be increased emotionality and irritability for the child. Often there's an impact on sleep, and again that then has an impact on their emotionality and their ability to cope, particularly in school. Kind of an impact on their kind of concentration and attention skills. If you think about these thoughts kind of dropping in and kind of distracting them, and the impact that would have, say, on schoolwork. There may be social withdrawal, so kind of withdrawing away from friends, friendship difficulties. There may be physical symptoms as well, so maybe headaches, but also stomach aches, others kind of psychosomatic impact on the child. There may be a fear of being alone for the child, a fear of death, a fear of illness, a fear of being away from others, and sometimes a kind of a regression to a previous stage of development. So children may start to wet the bed again, they may start to worry about sleeping on their own again, and those all being quite normal reactions to a loss or a bereavement. So it's a case of looking out for those kinds of things, understanding where they might be coming from, and being aware of those over time. So often after we've forgotten that a child has had a loss or bereavement, we may see some of these signs and behaviour changes and attribute them to other things and kind of forget about that loss or bereavement, but it will pop up for them at various stages of their development. So kind of being sensitive to that, really. And also just being aware that children can sometimes appear to cope quite well at the beginning and not be showing any of these things, but may start to face them and show some of them later on when that kind of reality of their changed circumstances begins to hit home. So not expecting that these will necessarily be there right at the beginning, but being sensitive to them over time. So just thinking about developmentally what might be going on for children, so how a teenager copes with bereavement and loss will be different to a baby, and all of the individual differences within each stage of development too. So a baby is going to be kind of impacted particularly by the emotional state of the adults who are looking after them. And so, that's going to be, what unsettles them and impacts them. Toddlers and young children tend not to understand the permanence of death and may keep asking when that person is coming back. There might be some quite magical thinking for children at this age, and if we think about fairy stories that we tell children, so they may think that they've done something bad to cause this to happen. They may think that if they're very good, that the person may come back, like in a fairy story. And so there's going to need to be some gentle kind of repetition about what has happened for these children. They may display what's happened through their play, and again that's quite a normal reaction and a way of the child kind of processing what has happened. Older children are going to start to be more aware of the permanence of death, and so consequently kind of worry about their own death and the death of other children. They're going to want more explanations about what's happened, and I'll come on to that later too. Older children are going to have a more adult sense of that permanence, maybe some more kind of philosophical and religious, spiritual kind of concepts, thinking about what has happened, the kind of meaning of life, and those kinds of things. And I guess it's important to remember that whilst the child will experience the loss and bereavement at the developmental stage that they're at when it happens, their understanding of the loss and the bereavement will also change over time as they developmentally change. So if there was a bereavement when the child was a baby and they would have reacted to how the adults were around them, that may still be or will still be impacting on them when they're a teenager, and they will be going through those more adult kind of reflections and what has happened. So it isn't just what happens at the time of the death, but also how the child is processing things over time to kind of bear in mind. How the child experiences loss and bereavement is also impacted by some of these other things. So on the right hand side, you've got individual characteristics, so the personality of the child, what's their previous experience of death, what's their cognitive development like, what are their language skills like, and certainly a child's ability to talk about what has happened, really influencing their ability to process that. What's the communication in the family like about what has happened, what's their culture, what's their faith. So all of these things are going to impact on the child's kind of grief and how they process things. In terms of the environment, again, what's the impact on the family been? How are others expressing their feelings around the child or young person? What support is available, kind of wider family, their peer group, those kinds of things. The circumstances of the death will certainly impact, and people certainly often report greater difficulty where there's been a sudden and unexpected death, or also where it's in very difficult circumstances, such as a murder or a suicide, and the feelings during those situations being much more intense. And it being harder to make sense of what has happened. Suicide itself will often bring a deep sense of rejection for the child. And there are also circumstances around how did the child find out about what happened. So those kinds of circumstances as well. And finally, the relationship that the child or young person had with the person who died will make a difference as well. If there was a strong attachment, then those feelings are going to be very strong. But also, what are the child's attachments now? Do they have other strong attachment figures that are going to be protective factors for them during this time? So children are likely to ask questions about what has happened, and sometimes those questions can be quite blunt. And that's to be expected and is normal. So the first principle in responding to questions is not to brush them aside. If we don't answer children's questions, the story that they create in their mind may be far worse than the information that we can get them. So trying to be honest with children, even if that's I don't know, and trying to find out, if you can, the answer to the child's question. The second principle is what we call the Goldilocks principle, and it's this sense of not too little information and not too much information. So trying to gauge what information is right for the child given their age and development. And we can generally gauge that we're going into the giving them too much, because the children will start to glaze over and not listen, and if we're not giving them enough information, they're going to keep asking and asking more questions. So we know we've got it right if we give the child an answer and they go, oh, okay, and kind of carry on with what they were doing. So that's what we're trying to get to. Trying to use language that the children can understand. So again, when we're talking to children about a loss or a bereavement, the information that we give them when they're small may be different to the information that we give them later. We may be adding more information to the story as they get older and they're ready to handle that information. So building up the picture over time. We don't have to tell children all of the information at the time, but kind of being aware that we do want them to have all of the information when they're ready to hear that. Trying to avoid being shocked by any blunt enquiries. Certainly, we've had children ask, what happens when you die? What does the coffin look like? Is the body in there? What happens at funerals? So children kind of wanting to know that information. And if that's difficult for the family to talk about because of the feelings it brings up, maybe if you're an independent person working in a school or setting, it's easier to check out with the family. Is it okay if I talk about the funeral with them and finding out the information to share? And being sensitive to different and a family and child's spiritual beliefs. So kind of what happens when you die can be well, some people think this, some people think that. So kind of being open and supportive of the child's spiritual beliefs. The child is also going to be influenced by the circles of support around them, and it's useful to map this out with a child or young person if you're working with them, and to know where they're going to draw their main source of support. So some children are going to want to mainly be supported by their family. And actually any support in school is more about kind of time out or giving them a break from these deep feelings and kind of establishing a relationship with someone in school who can support them if they need it. For some children, their families may be so distraught themselves that actually that's not a comfortable place for them to seek support. They don't want to further upset siblings or families, so maybe they do want to seek support from teachers or professionals in school. Or other adults, maybe there is wider family that might be able to support them. And some children, particularly those who are older, so high school children, are going to want to talk mainly to their peer group. And I guess it's being mindful that the peer group may not know how to do this, and so there may be some useful work to do with the peer group as well. So thinking through, what it is how they're going to open a conversation with their friend, how they're going to seek support for themselves, and those kinds of things. So thinking about how we might help children and young people to express their grief, again thinking about this principle about being child or young person led, kind of thinking through with them what it is that they'd like to do, and this sense of doing being quite important, particularly at the start of sort of processing a loss or bereavement. So lots of children and young people may want to send cards, write poems, write songs. Within cultures, we often send flowers. We may visit. Periods of mourning that exist within different cultures. There are kind of memorials possibly to plan with the individual or with a wider group or a community as to how to celebrate that person's life with something that's meaningful for them. The balloons kind of represent that often some people will use helium balloons to let these go as a way of kind of marking the bereavement, lighting candles. So there are lots of things that an individual or community might want to think about doing that helps with that kind of initial process of thinking about grief. There's also something about thinking about how we acknowledge with a child or young person that we know what has happened to them. And I know this is the part that we often feel uncomfortable about, and there's something about not wanting to upset the person in a public space, so we need to think about how to do this sensitively. But when children and young people and adults who've been bereaved have been asked about is there anything that they would have wanted to happen differently, it was that they wanted people to acknowledge what had happened to them. So there's something about letting a child or young person know that you know about what has happened, and then kind of establishing with them how they want you to check in with them, how frequently they want you to do that, how they want you to do it, so that you do show that you're keeping them in mind over time. And also just bearing in mind that loss or bereavement at each new transition. So there's obviously, say it was a parent that died, there are things about Father's Day and Mother's Day that you might want to check out with the child or young person, but also, you know, changes of class, receiving awards. There are all kinds of things that may be triggered again by that bereavement, and having them in mind and letting them know beforehand that you're aware that this might be an issue for them, and what should you do about it. Also things within the curriculum. So if you map out and look at what's in the curriculum, there are losses and bereavements throughout different subjects: history, English, music. You know, those concepts are covered across the curriculum. So again, you know, kind of pre-warning a child and checking out with them how they want that session to go. It's also helpful to think about, when we are checking in with children and young people, that the more specific we make our questions, the easier it is going to be for them. So rather than asking, how are you feeling, how are things, maybe you might want to ask, how are things at home, how are things going with your schoolwork, are there any lessons that are difficult, is there anything that you're worrying about, that you need help with, how are you sleeping? So those kinds of more specific questions will be easier for children to answer. So I said I'd mention some ideas for memory creation, and you've got a link at the bottom there for some further ideas. Certainly a number of ELSAs and other adults working with children in school will talk about creating a memory box or a memory book with a child or young person. Again, this means that it can be led by the child or young person as to what they want to put in there. It's an opportunity for sharing some positive memories and being able to talk about those. And also, while you're creating these things, so often kind of art and craft based activities, is when the child will start to talk and feel more comfortable doing that, rather than you sat opposite them asking them lots of questions. A memory box and a memory book are lovely as well, because they're in the control of the child or young person. They can put them away, they can take them out to look at when they're ready to do so. It doesn't have to be a physical thing though, with a box or a book. It could be an e-memory store, so kept online with pictures and images, poems, songs, those kinds of things could all be part of things together. A number of the ELSAs has said as well, when you're creating any of these things, it gives you the opportunity at the start to be very gentle in how you're doing this. So you would start by decorating the book or the box or setting the thing up without having to do any of the more difficult memory thinking until the child is ready. And again, if you've got regular sessions with a child or young person, knowing that sometimes you might be working on the memory box or book, but maybe sometimes you're not in that loss-oriented world, maybe they're in their restoration-oriented world and they want to talk to you about something else, or maybe play a game to have a break from their emotions for a while. There are lots of other things that you can create. I haven't got a memory jar on there, but memory jars which are used with coloured sand, memory bracelets like a friendship bracelets, you can make pom-poms, and all of those things can use colours to represent a different either feeling or a different memory that the child has got about the person that's died. And they don't necessarily have to talk to you about what that memory is, but they'll know that when they've created, say, a blue strand or a blue colour of sand in their jar, or a blue part of the pom-pom, what that is referring to. Making a dream catcher or a worry doll can be a very practical thing to do with the child, kind of addressing maybe if there are some sleep issues for the child, and also again you've got this joint craft activity that you can do with the child that may be the start of them wanting to talk about something with you. Stories and books are a lovely way of working with a child, a young person. It may be things that you share with home, that they may want to share at home, or maybe it's something that child wants to do in school. So kind of negotiating that with them. There are lots of activity books out there, so these would be where you'd buy the child their own individual book, and there are spaces in the book for them to draw and write things. And again, they don't need to work from beginning to end. They can select sections to work on depending on their mood at the time. So grief encounter at the start, perhaps aimed more at older children, and then Muddles, Puddles and Sunshine being an activity book for younger children. There's also a book at the end, which I think is fairly new, called Ollie the Octopus by Dr. Karen Treisman, and there's both a story book, which is the one that's there, and also an activity book that goes with Ollie the Octopus. And again, if you're being creative, you can create an Ollie the Octopus as well, which would be your shared way, maybe that the child wants to talk to you about something because Ollie the Octopus is on the desk, or maybe that's just their way of holding that person who's died in mind. There are lots of therapeutic stories. So Ollie the Octopus is one. The Day the Sea Went Out and Never Came Back is a therapeutic story by Margot Sunderland. And maybe this is something that the child wants to read on their own first, maybe be read at home first, but opportunity then to talk about the story if that's what they want to do. The stories, I guess, are generally aimed at younger children, but they could be used with older children, particularly say if they've got a younger sibling. You could share the book with the older child and say, do you think this would be appropriate for your younger sibling? And at the same time, they're getting an introduction to the story while they're looking at it as well. And you can create your own therapeutic stories as well. So Margot Sunderland has a book on how to do that, and we look at therapeutic storytelling and story writing in the ELSA training. There are just other lovely books that you'll kind of gather over time. We have boxes of books in our office which we can loan out to schools if that would be useful to you, but equally we would suggest that you start to build some books that are already there in your library for when you need to use them. Badges, Parting Gifts is one, and we've got a list of the books that are in our bereavement box if you wanted to see that to get an idea of the kinds of things that you might have in your own books. Finding Your Own Way to Grieve is a creative activity book for children and young people who are on the autism spectrum, so that might be a useful addition to you. And then there are kind of general books that just deal with feelings and don't kind of go near loss or bereavement in particular, so those might be useful too. So The Huge Bag of Worries would be one suggestion, so a way of why talking about your feelings might be a good idea. The All About BOD books also talk about why it's good to talk about feelings. And finally, you've got The Invisible String on there by Patrice Cast. Again, that's a storybook and also a workbook. And it's about attachment and relationships more than it is about loss and bereavement. So it talks about how we have an invisible string between us and the kind of important people in our lives, and how those strings continue even, say, when we move home or school. And I know a number of the ELSAs have used that during kind of COVID, for example, to show that they're still connected to the child, even though maybe they're in a different bubble to them at the time. One of the situations in the story is the child asks if they've still got an invisible string with their uncle who has died, and so that's where the kind of link to grief and bereavement comes in. So that might be something that you find a useful book too. Another thing that you might want to think about if you're a school or setting is having a bereavement policy or making a bereavement policy part of one of your other policies. It's much easier to think about what you're going to do when there's been a death in school when you've already thought about it beforehand. And so the Child Bereavement UK has got I've put a link there about how you might go about developing a policy. So that might be useful to you too. And so finally, as I begin to round up, just thinking about some of the sources of support that are out there. So you've got some national organisations there. Winston's Wish has lots of resources on their website, and also sections for children and young people and sections for families. So it's a good one to share. The Child Bereavement UK, as I say, has got lots. It's got further training on it if you wanted to pursue that, information about writing a policy, those kinds of things. Cruise offers support to adults who've been bereaved and also to children and young people, where the child or young person does want some independent support. And so there's a national website and also kind of local areas, and a site just for children and young people called Hope Again, so that's worth looking at. And then there are local sources of support as well. So St Elizabeth's Hospice in Ipswich runs training for professionals and drop-in cafes for young people, so it's worth investigating their support. There's Nicky's Way in the west of the county, who run groups for children in school and some one-to-one work as well. I mean, some of these services have been impacted during the COVID pandemic and may be operating differently, but will be returning at some point. And in Norfolk, there's Nelson's Journey, which works with children up there as well. So a few kind of local services as well as these kind of national ones as well. Our ELSAs all use a lot of the resources on the ELSA support website. So if you go on to or search ELSA support, and then once you're into that site, search bereavement, that will bring up some resources. And the resource the link that I've put there will take you to a whole selection of recommended books for carers, also for children and young people. There are links to websites and organisations, so that's kind of a good central location to find out some resources and ideas for working with children. And then finally, just about further kind of contacting, really. So if there is a bereavement in your school or community, in the headlines that go out to schools on a weekly basis, at the bottom it says, in the event of a bereavement within your school community, that you can contact the resolutions team, and there's their email address and their telephone number there, and they'll be able to offer some kind of advice and support over the telephone, and often will then link with us as well around psychological support where that's needed as well. There are lots of resources on the wellbeing and education pages, more specifically around sort of social and emotional mental health needs, so that's a good place to start, and also on our psychology and therapeutic services website, lots of resources around sleep and other resources that you can use. I've put my email address there if there's anything that you want to ask me. And also here is our kind of general email address as well. So that's a good place to come into, and our telephone number should you want to find out any more. Also about ELSA training and other things. So hopefully that has addressed some of the aims that I started with, that you know more now about what bereavement and loss means for children and young people, and the extent of loss and bereavement that may be in their lives, that you've got some ideas for how to support and are feeling more confident that it is your role to support them, and that you can do that comfortably. And seek support for yourself as necessary. So what we say to our ELSAs is that they have half-termly supervision. So thinking about how you're going to receive support yourself if you are working with a child or young person, and the things that you need to keep yourself well. And we also say to ELSAs that if you have recently been bereaved yourself, that maybe that's not a good time to work with a child or a young person. What's your grief and what's their grief can get a little mixed up. And so maybe a colleague working with a child or young person at that time until you're in a better place to be able to support. So yeah, hopefully you've feel more confident now or more interested to find out some more. And as I say, do look at the links on our web pages as well. Thanks for joining this session, and I hope that it was useful. Thank you. Bye.